Hello, everyone. Good evening from Jerusalem. Before we will start, let me just go briefly through technical issues. Your current status now is an attendee. If you would like to be visible on the camera and also at the end, maybe to ask a question via a microphone, please raise your hand and we will promote you to be a panelist. Regarding questions, please write all of them, questions and comments, via chat, and we will do our best at the end of the event to answer them. Thank you, and Karen, please start.
Thank you, Tadeusz. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome from Jerusalem. My name is Karen Sethill from the National Library of Israel, and it's gives me great pleasure to open the 6th event in our series marking the special Platinum Jubilee year in Her Majesty's Kingdom, celebrating the rich history of Anglo-Jewry. We're now coming to the end of this part of the series, where we focused on different formats of material culture to explore aspects of Anglo-Jewry through history. At the National Library of Israel, we have a natural affinity with collections of Judaica, so it's a particular pleasure and privilege for us to host Professor David Latchman this evening. Professor Latchman will be sharing some of his unique and extensive collection with us, and through these we'll talk about a running theme for Anglo-Jewish life in the UK. As I was surprised to learn, it seems that complaining about the rabbi's sermon after the synagogue service is a popular pastime that goes back many centuries. In his talk, Anglo-Jewry, A History of Controversy, Professor Latchman will be taking us back to the first Hebrew books printed for Jews in England and bringing us up to date to the 20th century. Professor Latchman is a leading UK academic, author and philanthropist, currently holding the position of Vice-Chancellor of Birkbeck University of London. Alongside this, Professor Latchman is a keen collector of Anglo-Judaica, a noted expert in the subject. He has accumulated a large and unique collection of pamphlets, books, and artifacts pertaining to Jewish life. Professor Latchman has produced the well-respected book, The United Synagogue, 150 Years of Service, and is preparing a sequel entitled 10 Chief Rabbis. Professor Latchman holds a BA with first-class honors from Cambridge University, as well as an MA and PhD from the same university. He also completed a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship at Imperial College London and holds a DSc from the University of London. David will speak for about 50 minutes, and after his talk, he will be happy to answer your questions. As Tadeusz explained, please put these in the Q&A or in the chat. Many thanks for speaking to us this evening, David, and I'm passing the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the National Library for inviting me and to all of you for joining us. I should begin, I think, with a disclaimer, which is that all the degrees that Karen mentioned are all in molecular biology genetics. They have nothing to do with our subject. So unlike previous speakers, I'm entirely an amateur, and I'm going to simply talk to you about some things in my collection, which I hope you'll find of interest. So, of course, this series, as I know, celebrates Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee, and it's therefore perhaps rather ironic that the resettlement of the Jews in England following their expulsion in 1290 took place in 1656, the very brief period when England did not have a monarchy. And of course, Manasseh ben Israel, who promoted the return of the Jews to England, knew this very well. And so this is a book that he published, and I hope you can see on your screens this, and it's entitled To His Highness the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, the Humble Address of Manasseh ben Israel. And Manasseh plays, in fact, on the fact that there is no longer a king. So he's clearly saying those rigorous laws made under the kings against so innocent a people would be happily repealed. So he's appealing to Cromwell, please repeal the laws which the previous kings made against the Jews. And of course, Cromwell did readmit the Jews, but they were readmitted obviously in a way which was rather vulnerable, because as we know, a few years later, Cromwell died, his son succeeded him, and eventually his son was ousted by the King Charles II, and the monarchy was restored. And Charles II set about undoing all the actions of the Commonwealth. And so many people thought he should expel the Jews. And so we have this pamphlet here, which is entitled Petition Against the Jews, presented to the King's Majesty by Thomas Violet of London Goldsmith. And although he was called Violet, his language, one might say, was rather violent. So he said, seeing the Jews protected by Oliver, Cromwell in other words, my humble prayer is that these wicked Jews cohabiting amongst us under such protections and protection, the law may now seize on them. Let us make no covenant with them, lest they be a snare in the midst of us, and the wrath of God burst out on us for admitting these cursed Jews among us. This is God's law. Well, of course, fortunately, Charles II didn't expel the Jews. He'd been helped by Jewish merchants during his exile in Amsterdam, and he was a very pragmatic fellow who knew that Jews were good for trade and so on. So the Jews resettled, but this period was a very turbulent one, not only in Anglo-Jewish history, but also in Jewish history as well, because it was the period of Shabbatai Tzvi. And of course, to an audience of the National Library, we don't need to say who Shabbatai Tzvi was, but perhaps some of you haven't seen a newspaper of the period. So this is the equivalent of your Haaretz or the Jerusalem Post or the London Times, and it's called the London Gazette. It came out every 3 days. This is the one from March the 12th to March the 15th, 1665. And it has a report from Smyrna, dated January, so it's taken 2 months to get there. Our trade has been of late much obstructed in these parts, all the Jews being in a kind of distraction upon the arrival of Sabbatai, a prophetical Jew, a Smyrnite born, lately come from Jerusalem, who in a few days has preached such opinions into these people that have persuaded that the number of years is accomplished. All of them are big with expectation of their Messiah and the restoration of the Jews. Now, why is this relevant to Anglo-Jewish history? Because this international dispute had its reverberations in Anglo-Jewish history. The first Haham of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, Jacob Sasportas, was one of the leading anti-Sabbatai Tzvi individuals. He published Tzitzas Neuvel Tzvi, which Gershom Scholem wrote about in detail, attacking Sabbatai Tzvi. He, in fact, Sasportas, fled London back to Amsterdam because of the plague. And the next Haham, Ailion, was a closet supporter of Shabbatai Tzvi. And in fact, at one point, he was asked to swear on his bag of tefillin that he was not a supporter of Shabbatai Tzvi. He did so without any problem whatsoever, but unfortunately, when the bag was eventually opened, it was found to contain 2 onions rather than his tefillin. So he'd sworn a sacred oath on 2 onions that he was not a supporter of Shabbatai Tzvi. Now, this whole dispute, and the reason I'm going into it, had its reverberations later in Anglo-Jewish history, right at the beginning of the 18th century. Because at 1701, the Sephardim appointed probably the greatest Haham they have ever had in England. I'm holding his portrait up, and I hope you can see that. This is Haham David Nieto in a very rare print, in which he looks perhaps like the sorts of prints of contemporary clergymen, or perhaps Isaac Newton, or whatever. He was a great scholar, a doctor, produced many theological works, and yet was attacked because it was claimed that he had preached and said that God and nature were the same thing. And this was Shabbatai Tzviism, this was Spinozism, and so on. And a certain fellow, Joshua Zarfati, refused to go into a house where the Haham was celebrating a wedding on the grounds that he would not be under the same roof as a heretic. And so the Haham was forced to defend himself. He published this book, which I just show you the title page, De la Divina Providencia, saying that God and nature were not the same, but God operated very often through nature. He expelled and issued a cherem against the people who had attacked him. And one of them, who died during this period, as a Sephardi, suffered the extreme humiliation of having to be buried in the Ashkenazi burial ground, rather than being buried with his Sephardi cohorts. In the end, they appealed to perhaps the greatest rabbi of the age, Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi. And the clue to his greatness is that he was Ashkenazi, the Klaus Rabbiner of Altona, but also given by the Sephardim the title of Chacham. And Chacham Tzvi was asked to give his view, and he gave his view, in entire support of David Nieto. This is the Spanish pamphlet in which he did this, the decision of Tzvi Ashkenazi and his beis din. But the greatest importance of this is that it was not published just in Spanish, it was published in Hebrew as well. And so this controversial pamphlet of 1705 is the first Hebrew text produced for Jews in this country, as opposed to Hebrew grammars produced for clergymen who wanted to learn Hebrew. So our history of controversy has begun, because it has begun with the first Hebrew printing for Jewish people was not some great sefer or some religious work, it was this. So Chacham Tzvi supported Nieto, and in the end, Nieto triumphed because Chacham Tzvi had supported him. Less happy, perhaps, for the incumbent chief rabbi was what went on in the Ashkenazi side. So the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazim, Aaron Hart, who had been appointed in 1705, did a divorce for him. He wrote a get for someone who was planning to run away to the West Indies to escape his gambling debts. And he wanted to go and make his fortune in the West Indies, this fellow. And he didn't, of course, want anybody to know that he was going, because if it was announced that he was going, all his debtors would jump on him. So the divorce was done secretly, and a certain Mordechai Hamburger, the son-in-law of Gluckel of Hamelin, the famous diarist, questioned the nature of the divorce. And so again, Aaron Hart excommunicated him. This time they appealed to Chacham Tzvi, and Chacham Tzvi supported the rebels, showing that he was not simply a supporter of the incumbents. Aaron Hart published his defense of himself, and this is since the Chacham Tzvi book is partly Hebrew and partly Spanish, this is the first entirely Hebrew text printed for Jews in England, called Urim v'Tumim, and probably you can't see, but towards the bottom it says produced in London under the wonderful reign of the marvelous Anna, Aleph Nun Aleph in much larger letters, and that is of course Queen Anne. So relevant to our theme is that the Urim v'Tumim author, Aaron Hart, wanted to show that we are under a wonderful person, the Queen Anne. The rivals, Mordechai Hamburger, he got his house tutor, if you like, his children's rabbi, to produce this, Masorti, the Tale of a Rabbi, by Jonathan Hollerschau, which is the reply to to Urim v'Tumim. And he also played up the Englishness and the royalty and so on. Here's a translation of a little bit that Cecil Roth did. I have no fear, he writes, for we, our brethren of the house of Israel, live in the kingdom of England, under rulers and princes and lords who deal with us with kindness and mercy. They may indeed be reckoned as the pious ones of the nations of the world. If a man give them a house full of gold and silver, they would do no injustice or wrongdoing, but act only as is written in their law books. So clearly very pro whatever. And this dispute did result, unlike the Sephardi one, in a split. So the Aaron Hart was rabbi of the Great Synagogue, the first Ashkenazi synagogue, and the rebels went away and founded the Hamburg Synagogue within a few yards of the Great Synagogue, and it persisted as a rival to the Hamburg. In 1870, as some of you will know, the United Synagogue was formed, joining all the synagogues together. And the equivalent of the charity commissioners insisted that every member of the 6 founding synagogues had to agree to the formation of the United Synagogue. The Hamburg was already sort of tottering along and not doing very well, and its members were fearful that they would be shut down by the United Synagogue. So they made an agreement that the Hamburg Synagogue would never be closed. And that was the condition of the United Synagogue. Now, some of you with more knowledge of England may wonder, so where is the Hamburg Synagogue? Well, in 1936, the United Synagogue did what we could only refer to as a dray. It merged the Great Synagogue into the Hamburg and formed the Greater Hamburg. So the Hamburg was never closed. The Great Synagogue was somehow afterwards bombed and everything ceased to exist. But the Hamburg was never closed, as was promised in 1870. So Anglo-Jewry began its first 2 shuls and its needed 3rd shul, the new synagogue, through these religious disputes. And it was not until about 5 years later that the first liturgical or scholarly work was actually published in Hebrew in England. And I can't resist showing to you, even though it's entirely irrelevant to my theme, because I don't think this is in the National Library. So those of you who are members of staff can check, but this is a thing published in 1712, Seder Avodah for Yom Kippur. Now, clearly they used the Machzorim, the festival prayer books from Amsterdam, and they must have done the Avodah slightly differently in the Musaf of Yom Kippur. So this was published as a separate work, And I've never seen this referred to in any bibliography, published in 1712, probably by Haham Nieto, because the border of it is very similar to the border of his works. So I just throw that in as a sort of whatever. Now, Aaron Hart, of course, continued in office until he died in 1756. And actually, interestingly, from the point of view of religious disputes that we've had in our day, where, for example, Lord Sachs was taken to a task for saying that other religions were important and had validity. Aaron Hart, when he was an old man, said to somebody who tried to convert him to Christianity that he would remain a Jew as he was born. And then he said, very interestingly, had I been born a Mohammedan, I would have stayed as such, which is a very interesting view. I haven't asked the present Chief Rabbi whether he would like to agree with that statement or not. Meanwhile, after Aaron Hart died, he was succeeded by Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch, afterwards called Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, from when he became Chief Rabbi of Berlin. He stayed for only 8 years, and he didn't really have much time to get involved in controversies. A number of his books remained in England because his son, as we shall see, Solomon Herschel, became Chief Rabbi, and he had the habit of making notes in his books. And I'm just showing you one. I have a number in my collection. So here you see he's interleaved the book and he's written notes on the opposite page. This is the Shulchan Aruch. And interestingly, this is the only place I've ever seen where he signs as in London, which was only a brief part, of course, of his career. And he signs as well in English, Hirsch Lewin. And interestingly, he's always called in English Hart Lion. There's a print of him called Hart Lion. I don't think he was called Hart Lion. He was called Hirsch Lewin. And that's what he signed his name as. Now, he, of course, when he left after 8 years, he was asked, why are you leaving to go to be Rabbi of Halberstadt? And he said, because this is the first Shiloh that I've been asked since I have been here. So he lamented the lack of scholarship in Anglo-Jewry, which is perhaps still more or less true today. He also had a wonderful line about his subsequent communities, which were Halberstadt, Mannheim, and then finally Chief Rabbi of Berlin, which was one of the top posts in the world at that time, obviously. And he said that he met, in Halberstadt, he met a man, and this man was looking very sad and very down at heel. The next time he met him was in Mannheim, and he was running about and running all over the place. And in Berlin, he met the man was sitting in a cafe, smoking and relaxing and whatever. So he asked him, why did you behave differently in these 3 cities where I was the rabbi? He says, in Halberstadt, I am the Yetzer Hara, he said, the evil inclination. In Halberstadt, they were extremely pious, so there was nothing I could do. In Mannheim, they were susceptible, so I had to run about trying to lead them astray. But in Berlin, they were astray anyway, so there was no need for me to do anything. So much for Tzvi Hirsch Berlin. And he then, as I say, left, went on to greater things, and was succeeded, and this will be important in a moment, as Rabbi of the Great Synagogue by David Tabler Schiff. And David Tabler Schiff arrived at a very exciting time for Anglo-Jewry. The Great Synagogue was rebuilt and reconsecrated. This, I think, is a possibly unique copy of the Order of Service in 1766, one of the first Anglo-Jewish orders of service for the reopening of the new Great Synagogue. And I'm showing this to you mainly because I want to read you what happens at the end in terms of our royal theme. So at the end it says, Royal George, that's George III, may he prosper and stand secure, endow him with health and length of years, so that his name may be magnified in the land and in all places wherever he treadeth. Guard and preserve from danger and trouble. Chorus, may George III, our sovereign, and all the royal family live forever. Well, they didn't live forever, of course, but they did at least have their succession. And in 1770, around this time, there began real large-scale, not large-scale, but larger-scale Hebrew printing in London. They started printing Machzorim, Slichus, and whatever, and they printed the very first Siddur. Here it is, Tefillot for the Siddur, printed by Mears and Alexander in 1770. And it contains a prayer for the royal family, not a poem, but just a prayer, which begins, and those of English origin may have heard this before, may he that dispenseth salvation unto kings and dominion unto princes, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, who maketh way. So this is the prayer for the royal family that more or less has been said until recent years, but for George III. And for those of you who like sort of interesting things about continuity, I reprinted this Siddur, the first London Siddur from 1770, for my son's bar mitzvah last year. And our guests in Shabbos morning were able to use this Siddur. They couldn't make the prayer for Queen Elizabeth from it, but they could do virtually everything else. So that shows you the continuity of this Siddur. Now, I mentioned that Tevler Schiff was Rabbi of the Great Synagogue. But he was not undisputed Rabbi of England, because the Hamburg Synagogue, supported by the New, so remember the Hamburg that was founded as a result of the breakaway, the New was another breakaway, they brought in their own rabbi, who was called Meshulam Zalman Emden, the son of the famous Jacob Emden, and the grandson, in fact, of the Chacham Tzvi. And he signs himself he gives a haskoma to a book called Kisei Melech in 1767, and he signs himself as Rabbi of London and the provinces. In other words, Chief Rabbi, not the Rabbi of one shul. Now, this is actually very important because the provinces were the scene of the battleground between Tevler Schiff and Meshulam Zalman Emden. And the reason being that in Portsmouth, half the community supported Tevler Schiff and half the supported Meshulam Zalman. And so the half who supported Meshulam Zalman broke away and started their own shul. So the schism of the Great and the Hamburg is now being mirrored in the middle of the 18th century in Portsmouth. And so there were two, each one consulted its own rabbi, and you had effectively two rabbis who were effectively rabbis of London and the provinces. A key feature, however, was that one side had the services of a certain Reb Leib Aleph, who was the mole in Portsmouth. And he was one of the rebels. But in the end, through the fact whether he would do milah for all the people, in the end, the Portsmouth community came together. The richer people in the community were supporters of Tevler Schiff. And this is the reason that Tevler Schiff became the undisputed chief rabbi, and that the rabbi of the Great Synagogue became then the chief rabbi of London and the provinces. And that's why we have a chief rabbi who was originally rabbi of the Great Synagogue. And so by the time Tevler Schiff died in 1791 and Solomon Herschel succeeded him, Solomon Herschel is described. So here is a print. I'm sorry, I didn't say he's the son of Tzvi Hirsch Berlin. So he now comes along, and here he is as the frontispiece of a Yom Kippur Machzor. So I'm not sure we would do that today, Chief Rabbi as a frontispiece to a Machzor. And he's described here as Reverend Solomon Herschel, Chief Rabbi of the German and Polish Jews in England. Now, this Machzor has much deeper significance than the fact that it says Chief Rabbi of whatever, because certain Alexander, who was the son of the person who printed the Siddur that we saw earlier, he had his own Machzor. And so there were two rival Machzor. Here's his Machzor. So again, this is all German for German and Polish Jews. And he didn't just produce a rival Machzor, he put in the Yom Kippur Machzor, a 16-page supplement in which he attacked the chief rabbi. So the chief rabbi was having his picture in the other Machzor. He didn't like that. And he said, the other Machzor is full of errors, and the chief rabbi is doing all these things and supporting the wrong people. And so he has a wonderful quote here, and it's interesting what you said, Karen, about sermons. I'm not sure whether this is a little bit stronger than just saying your sermon wasn't very good. So Alexander, this is in the back of a Yom Kippur Machzor. So people are davening Yom Kippur from this Machzor, and they can turn to the back and read this. These circumstances determined me to appeal in this manner to the world at large on the justice of my cause. Every feeling heart will sympathize in my sufferings and feel the severity of the case. The Dryden's opinion is verified in this divine, that priests of all religions are the same. If it should be asked how I came to place the address in this volume instead of the last, I answer that the deeds of this pastoral transgressor, that's the chief rabbi, so he's calling the chief rabbi a pastoral transgressor, should appear public on so pious a day, and that those who are inclined to read it might form an opinion of him when he devoutly repeats, for the sin which I have sinned against thee through hatred without cause. So that's a quotation, of course, from the Al-Khait prayer. So he's saying when you see the chief rabbi clapping Al-Khait, you should think what an evil person he is. So Herschel, despite being undisputed chief rabbi, didn't really have it very easy. And Alexander continued his attacks, and the chief rabbi, in some innocent decision, decided to chop down some trees in Alderney Road Cemetery in Mile End in London, which I visited recently, and I saw some tree stumps, and I was slightly intrigued whether these were the same tree stumps that were cut down in 1808. But whether they were or not, Alexander decided to publish this pamphlet, which again is not in the National Library, I don't think. And it's got a caricature portrait of Solomon Herschel, you may be able to see, much worse than the nice one in the Machzor. And it's called The Axe Laid to the Root, or Ignorance and Superstition Evident in the Character of the Reverend Solomon Herschel, Major Rabbi, commonly called the High Priest of the Jews in England, in moral letters addressed to him on occasion of his having ordered the trees to be felled that were permitted for many years to grow in the old burial ground. This is really a dispute about nothing. And in looking through the pamphlet, I couldn't actually find anything in which he actually attacks the tree issue. So I thought I'd just read you a poem instead that he's got in here. So he's written this poem. Not all who are accounted good deserve to bear that name. The wicked are some understood to put in for their claim. But flattered by the illiterate rout, who judge of things far off, that when they spy the priest cry out, the man of God, the Rov, but strip him of this admiration, show us the real man, without that mystic inspiration, admire him if you can. So Solomon Herschel didn't have it easy, and that wasn't the end of his trouble. So shortly again after he arrived, he gave his Haskoma to a book called Sharshei Emunah, The Elements of Faith, by somebody called S.I. Cohen. And you might have thought this was entirely innocent. Cohen was obviously very happy with it. He writes somewhere in here about, I composed this small tract under the sanction of the learned and revered Dr. Solomon Herschel, Chief Rabbi of the German Jews, who kindly perused and approved of the manuscript. A children's book approved by a Chief Rabbi. You might think that that was rather innocent. Nonetheless, we have a whole series of pamphlets now putting various causes. The first one is called Tene Bikurim, a basket of criticism, by somebody called Solomon Bennett, who writes, those fatal elements of faith do not rest entirely with Salom Cohen, the author of the same, as it does with his dignissimo and amplissimo, doctore and summo pontifex, Solomon Herschel, rabbi of the German Jews in England, who sanctioned it and gave his testimony in the Haskoma. So he attacks that. And then there's a reply. The reply, rather strangely, is not written by Solomon Herschel. It's written by somebody called Meyer Rintel, who was a Moel and a poultry shochet. And so he, of course, is a great supporter of Solomon Herschel. And it says, it is only to serve as an instrument against Solomon Bennett, he says, which may vent his malice against the Gaon, the Av Beis Din, a man whose bright virtues are too dazzling for this owl to bear, and whose goodness of heart is so contrary to all the feelings of this sour critic. Unfortunately, Rintel does say, it happens that some things in the preface of the Elements of Faith are of a questionable nature. So he's admitting there's something wrong here, but like all prefaces, this was composed after the book had been finished, and Hagar the Av Beis Din never had sight of it and cannot be said to have sanctioned it. So they put themselves in a rather strange position, Herschel's party, because they'd used this poultry shaykhut, and of course he'd said, well, it's only just the introduction, the rest of it's fine. So in fact, of course, Bennett jumped on this, and he produced this work, this is the final one, The Present Reign of the Synagogue of Duke's Place, in which he also has his picture, because he was actually a picture engraver, amongst other things, and he attacks Herschel and basically says, Meyer Cohen, a poultry slayer, a member of the Petticoat Lane gentry, fixed his name to that literary production, Minchas Kanaos, the offering of vengeance, a fine title indeed, consistent with such a filthy character. But we have a right to inquire, is that filthy poultry slayer the very author of the same or not? And then he comes back and says, our most learned grand rabbi, the Reverend Dr. Solomon Herschel, rabbi of the German Synagogue, the venom which that rabbi fostered against me, Bennett in other words, in his bosom from my abode at Berlin on account of some trivial dissension between me and his father, Rabbi of Berlin, as observed, was not extinguished by his son, Rav Solomon Herschel. He squinted with an avengeful eye upon Mr. Bennett for not paying obeisance to him in his exalted station, for not bowing and kneeling before his throne among all his audiences. So that one carried on as well. But of course, none of this was really a threat to Solomon Herschel's position. It was basically a few dissidents attacking him. And interestingly, as you will have noted, attacking him for not being religious enough. He shouldn't have cut the trees down. He shouldn't have supported a dubious Machzor. He shouldn't have got involved in terms of this Elements of Faith book. And now, however, at the end of the reign of Solomon Herschel in the 1840s, we come to a dispute which still echoes to this day, and of course, which is a dispute about the chief rabbi not being too religious. And so I read you now this declaration by Solomon Herschel, signed also by the Dayanim and David Meldola of the Sephardim. Information having reached me from which it appears that certain persons calling themselves British Jews publicly and in their published book of prayer reject the oral law, I deem it my duty to declare that according to the laws and statutes held sacred by the whole house of Israel, any person or persons publicly declaring that he or they reject and do not believe in the oral law cannot be permitted to have any communion with us Israelites in any religious rite or sacred act. So this is the Cherem against the West London Synagogue, the start of reform in this country. You could put this down to the old man, Solomon Herschel, a bit past it and whatever, but actually his successor, Nathan Adler, continued it. And I quote from a pamphlet produced by the West London Synagogue shortly after Nathan Adler had started his job. And it says, your new spiritual chief has at length manifested his views, and they are such as must give unfeigned regret to every rational and enlightened Israelite. Not only has he announced his intention not to walk in the path of toleration, but he has gone beyond Dr. Herschel himself and has been unfortunately induced to give to the excommunication a force with which even its framers never sought to invest it. So Nathan Adler, who was the first actually to be elected as chief rabbi rather than rabbi just of the great synagogue, refused to allow a marriage of the daughter of somebody of West London Synagogue with a member of an orthodox synagogue unless the bride promised never to enter the West London Synagogue again. And of course, the reform controversy continues in a certain way to this day, but it really did start to die down in the later part of the 19th century. It became a modus vivendi that everybody lived together. And there are two real reasons for that. One is that at the beginning of the 20th century, something else occurred in terms of religious pluralism, which was seen by the rabbinate of Anglo-Jewry, the chief rabbinate, as much, much worse. And that, of course, was the foundation of liberal Judaism, which effectively had a much more radical program, more akin to continental or American reform than did the somewhat lukewarm reform that occurred in England. Herman Adler, the son of Nathan Adler, he preached against this. I just quote from his sermon called The Old Paths, and he says, is there not reason to apprehend that the encouragement given to this attempt may lead to the establishment not of a synagogue, but of a church on the lines of the temples in Berlin and in Chicago, with their Sunday services, their abandonment of Hebrew, and what a quarterly reviewer justly describes as their exaggerated deference to the superficial customs of their non-Jewish neighbors. And in this private letter, which he wrote to a journalist and author, M.J. Lander, he quotes with disapproval Claude Montefiore, the leader of the liberal Judaism. Modern Judaism needs both the rabbis and Jesus. If modern Judaism may claim Isaiah as one of its founders, it may also claim Jesus. He too is ours. And this theme of the relationship of liberal Judaism to Christianity was taken up by Chief Rabbi Hertz, who became Chief Rabbi in 1911, of whom you may well have heard it said, he never ceased to search for a peaceful solution when all other possibilities had failed. Some of you may know that the main liberal synagogue, a beautiful structure, is opposite Lord's cricket ground, and Chief Rabbi Hertz said that when asked where the liberal synagogue was, he said, not on the Lord's side, because it was opposite the cricket ground. And so he has a few quotes in this series, The New Paths, which is obviously intended to follow from Herman Adler's Old Paths, 1926. He says, many of these rabbis, which was inverted commas, for some mysterious reason, men who are devoid of rabbinic knowledge and have definitely broken with rabbinic teaching, insist on assuming this title, declare that fasting on the Day of Atonement is a superstition, and they practice what they preach. One of them has even gone further. He has started an agitation to do away with Yom Kippur altogether. I am the only good Jew among all the Chicago Rabbonim, the liberal Rabbi Emil Hirsch used to say. I close on Shabbos. The Shabbos of the Jew is dead, he said. Let us bury it. The Sunday must squarely and openly be made the Sabbath. And finally, one more quote, because I think Hertz really has a fantastic whatever. Needless to say, and this relates to the Claude Montefiore, Whenever Jews have come to terms with the gospel, open apostasy to the Christian church has been the result. Now, interestingly, so you see that liberal Judaism has become the sort of the thing that has to be attacked. And it was accompanied, in fact, almost in Hertz's case, by a tolerance, and in Adler as well, actually, of a tolerance of reform. So the Conference of Anglo-Jewish Preachers that Hermann Adler founded and Hertz continued had various reform ministers as its members. And indeed, when Chief Rabbi Herzog, when he was Chief Rabbi of Ireland, when Chief Rabbi Herzog was invited to join, here's, I've actually framed the letter, so I'm showing you the letter as a framed whatever. He says, so he was invited to join this preachers' conference, which included reform ministers, but not liberal. So he says, I can approach and have often associated with Christian ministers, Catholic and Protestant, in various directions, social, philanthropic, etc. But I cannot become a member of a specifically Jewish religious organization, which by the mere fact of its exclusion of the ministers of the Reform congregation and its exclusion of the ministers of the liberal synagogue, tacitly recognizes the principles and teachings for which the Berkeley Street body, that's the West London Synagogue, stands. So a magnificent letter by Chief Rabbi Herzog, virulently attacking this distinction between liberal and reform. But in fact, Hertz actually went even further. So here's the program for the West London Synagogue extension opening. And who do we find amongst the speakers on this occasion but Chief Rabbi Hertz? Apparently, according to one of his defenders when he was attacked on this, he spoke about religious indifference and neglect of Jewish education. Now, you do have to remember, of course, this is 1934, so the Nazis were rising in power, and they did have other things to worry about. But I don't think you would find a chief rabbi today attending the opening of a reform synagogue hall. So Hertz, virulently anti-liberal, but he did have to concede something. So in that time, the chief rabbi and the board of deputies had to sanction a congregation as Jewish if it was to be allowed to conduct marriages. So he's been asked now in 1934, will he sanction the liberal thing? So it says, although I strongly disapprove of the religious practices and principles of the liberal synagogue, I am not justified in declaring that its members have left the ranks of Jewry and do not profess Judaism. In the circumstances, and this is 1934, I'm prepared to agree to the formality of certifying that the body in question is an organization for purposes of worship and kindred activities. Excuse me. It must be understood, however, that the chief rabbinate can take no responsibility for the legality or otherwise in Jewish law of any ritual act performed by the ministers of that congregation. And I don't think anybody would ask them to, but anyway. So that was one of the main reasons why reform became respectable, liberal became less respectable, but still now part of the modus vivendi. The other, of course, argument is that we are in a period now, if we go back to the 1880s, where there was huge, massive immigration of ultra-Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe. And so clearly now the right became very important. And perhaps it was felt that the English gentlemen of the United Synagogue and the English gentlemen of the Reform movement had to stand together in order to deal with this. And so, of course, the immigrants did not like the kashrus and the shechita of the chief rabbi and his beis din. And so, for example, the Machzor was founded, and this is, I'm going to hold up, it's butcher's book. They started their own shechita with their own butchers. This is the original butcher's book. Every page is the same, and every butcher had to sign, if he wanted to be under the Machzor, sign one of these pages. And it's, you have to sign this. Every butcher himself, as well as his family, if employed in the business, must be strictly religious and observing all the Jewish laws and rites. They must not shave with a razor and must particularly observe the Sabbath. Only kosher meat, to which is attached the seal of the Machzor, is to be found on his premises. This led to a huge furor because, of course, shechita generates loads of money. And every Jewish community in the world, certainly outside Israel, operates on dead animals, shechita, and dead Jews, funerals. Those are the sources of money. So anything that seizes shechita is really bad. So the beis din were really annoyed about this. Each side produced these pamphlets and posters. Here's a poster of the beis din showing that various rabbinic authorities supported them. And we even have, I have in my collection, the original letter of Rabbi Yitzchok Elchanan Spector of Kovno, who attacked the Machzor, because of course you're not supposed to set up an alternative shechita. So if a Rav is told somebody set up an alternative shechita, he will oppose it. But on the other hand, of course, you might argue that that's perfectly valid if the shechita is not very good in the first place. The Beis Din were very pleased with this letter, and apparently Herman Adler, the chief rabbi, ran off to Lord Rothschild, the leader of the community, and said, Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector supports us. And the chief rabbi, Lord Rothschild, had no idea who Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector was. But he reasoned to himself, my chief rabbi is the greatest rabbi in the world. So why does he need the support of this foreign rabbi from Kovno? And of course, it's said that Lord Rothschild became much more conciliatory after that and tried to reach a modus vivendi. And in the end, they did reach a modus vivendi, in which the Machzor Shechita came under the authority of the Board of Shechita, but they retained that they had to be accepted by the Rav of the Machzor, had to accept their Shechita. One little more thing about shechita. This is the Slaughter of Animals Bill, 1930. And in this bill, which mandated stunning, they said the provisions shall not apply where an animal is supported for the food of Jews by a Jew duly licensed for that purpose by the chief rabbi. Now, you might think that's very good, but unfortunately, the Federation of Synagogues, the Union of Orthodox, and the Sephardim didn't like that, because why should the chief rabbi be given this right? Why should it not be everybody else, everybody together? And so in the end, there was a huge uproar. This is a letter from Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Kotsk to Rabbi Ferber, very well-known London rabbi, in which he gives a very interesting point. He says, one should not vest authority in an office, because the current chief rabbi may be jolly good, but who knows who will succeed him. And so in the end, a compromise was reached in which a rabbinical commission was established. And that rabbinical commission, with Spanish and Portuguese, the Union of Orthodox, Federation, as well as the United Synagogue, is actually what regulates shechita to this day. So that's a bit about attacks from the right. Just to mention briefly, of course, that Herman and Nathan Adler didn't have it easy in their own communities. There were calls from within the United Synagogue for all sorts of modifications to the ritual. Nathan Adler, in this pamphlet here, refused to abolish the Kol Nidra. He said, I'm aware that some isolated cases have occurred in which malicious foes of Judaism have asserted that by this formula, we seek to absolve ourselves of the binding force of oaths sworn in a court. I am strongly of the opinion that we should not allow ourselves to be influenced by an accusation so infamously false to alter the form of any prayer in our liturgy. He did allow, however, Avarachamim on Shabbos only to be recited on a few Shabboses and not to be recited on every Shabbos. Herman Adler faced the same attack, and just to show you how broad his one was, the second Adler chief rabbi, listen to these proposals which he rejects. The proposals that the shofar be sounded on the first day of the new year when it falls on the Sabbath, that the ordinary weekday service be read on the second day of the festivals, in other words, abolishing the second day Yom Tov, and that a musical instrument be used on Sabbath and festivals cannot be entertained. They are contrary to our law. So in addition to pressure from Reform and Liberal and pressure from ultra-Orthodox, he had his own problems, both Nathan and Herman Adler, internally. I'm going to conclude by talking about a controversy which there may be people listening who actually remember when it happened, because it was only around 50 years ago, and it is the controversy concerning Louis Jacobs. Now, Louis Jacobs was effectively the bright boy of the Anglo-Jewish rabbinate, and clearly destined for great things, including probably to become chief rabbi. This is a little invitation from 1947 to the opening of a yeshiva called Shari Tzion. And it says, the honorary officers of Yeshiva Shari Tzion, Dan Abramsky, the Rosh Beis Din, will take the chair. Dan Lazarus will speak, deputy for the chief rabbi. Rabbi Munk will speak. Rabbi Koppel-Rosen, Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, and a student. I was informed a few weeks ago that the student was actually the future Rabbi Baruch Horowitz, who founded Devar Yerushalayim. As a list of eminence of ultra-Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy, they also included an address by Rabbi Louis Jacobs, Rosh Yeshiva, sandwiched between Rabbi Munk and Rabbi Koppel-Rosen. So he was seen as the bright boy of Anglo-Jewry. And yet, Rabbi Jacobs, I must say, who I have a great deal of sympathy for, although I don't follow his derech, published this book in 1957 called We Have Reason to Believe. And it says at the end of the sort of blurb on the flyleaf, you may disagree violently with some of the author's contentions. You may find yourself in accord with everything he says, but agreeing or disagreeing, you are bound to find it exhilarating to accompany him on his journey towards a faith that transcends but is firmly grounded in reason. And so he believed that reason and biblical criticism and so on should be applied to the Torah. And this copy here is dedicated for my friends in whom I have good reason to believe, Gertie and William Frankel, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle and at the time. And William Frankel, the then editor of the Jewish Chronicle, urged Jacobs to keep quiet and not to publish this until he became chief rabbi. And basically, Jacobs destroyed his orthodox career by publishing this book rather than keeping quiet until after he became chief rabbi. He was then, he was appointed at Jews College with an expectation that he would have become principal of Jews College, but he was blocked by Brodie. He then wanted to go back to the New West End Synagogue, where he'd previously been rabbi. His appointment was blocked by Chief Rabbi Brodie, and a huge furor broke out. I'm not going to discuss it in detail, and particularly because there are people alive who were still involved in it, but I do want to read you a letter from a certain Rabbi, Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz. The future chief rabbi and successor of Brodie is writing from his position in Fifth Avenue Synagogue to the very Reverend Dr. Israel Brodie. My dear chief rabbi, as you are no doubt aware, during your absence, I have been approached by the Beth Din to obtain a statement from Rav Soloveitchik in support of your ruling on the Jacobs appointment. I had submitted the relevant literature to Rav Soloveitchik. It goes without saying that he is fully in accord with your judgment and he would wish to do everything in his power to render whatever effective assistance he can. So we have the next chief rabbi supporting the incumbent chief rabbi in his battles with Jacobs. And I'm going to take a big risk now for those who might be Masorti or Rabbi Jacobs supporters and read the last paragraph of Jacobowitz's letter. Incidentally, Rabbi Soloveitchik, having now read some of Jacob's utterances, was quite struck by the mediocrity of his scholarship and surprised that a man of such modest stature should now present any serious challenge. Well, he did. And the United Synagogue had to, because the New West End refused to accept that he would not become their rabbi, it is resolved in accordance with the provisions of Clause 51A of the United Synagogue Act that the honorary officers and the Board of Management of the New West End are hereby discharged and deposed, and that Frank Archibald Rossdale, Frank Levine, Salman Levin, and Samuel Boxer are hereby appointed to manage the New West End Synagogue. Well, what did the New West End Synagogue members do? Of course, they met and passed by 250 votes for and 11 against to resolve to constitute an independent Orthodox congregation under the name of the New London Synagogue and the spiritual leadership of Rabbi Jacobs. The last paragraph, though, is amazing here. At the same time, this meeting affirms the intention to work for the return of the United Synagogue to its own traditions of tolerance and the progressive conservatism referred to in the preamble to its bylaws. So this was not really a religious revolution. This was effectively a plea for tolerance and a desire to follow Louis Jacobs. And in fact, I have in my collection a letter from Louis Jacobs to the chief rabbi, which says, you may know that it was decided this morning to form an independent Orthodox congregation of which I shall be the rabbi. If you feel with me that this break with the United Synagogue can still be averted, I shall be glad to come to see you at any time to discuss the matter. Well, it wasn't averted, and of course the Masorti movement now has several synagogues, but it did not really destroy the centrist, did not really become, if you like, the central orthodoxy of Anglo-Jewry. And there's a very good reason for that, because Anglo-Jews don't think, and they don't think about religion. Had they thought about religion, probably the majority would believe with Jacobs in terms of the analysis of the Torah, and certainly the majority of Anglo-Jewish ministers at that time did believe that, and wrote to support Jacobs, wrote a letter to the chief rabbi supporting Jacobs, but probably not true of ministers now. So this didn't happen. It didn't become a major movement, but now we do have Masorti, we do have liberal, we do have reform, we have ultra-Orthodox in the Union of Orthodox, we have the Federation, we have the United Synagogue. So Anglo-Jewry, ostensibly completely disunited, yet I think is united in one thing, which is the theme of our your series of talks at the National Library, which is basically the theme of the royal family and our loyalty to the royal family in Britain. And I'm going to quote from Chief Rabbi Moses' message on the Platinum Jubilee. As we celebrate the historic milestone of Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee, we thank the Almighty for this extraordinary role model who sets a wonderful example of service, duty, selflessness, and most significantly, of respecting all people with sensitivity and dignity. I think all Anglo-Jews, almost without exception, could sign up to that. I think they might criticize the Chief Rabbi's sermon on occasion, but I don't think anybody is planning to publish a Yom Kippur Machzor with an attack on Rabbi Mervis, although equally, I don't think anybody's going to produce one with his portrait in it either. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of my collection, which, as some of you will have realized, or all of you will have realized, is my real passion. And I hope that it's illuminated some of the pathways of Anglo-Jewish history and some of the difficulties that past Chief Rabbis have had. And thank you once again to all of you for listening and to the National Library for organising this.
Thank you so much. And what a lovely way to end with that Rabbi Mervis's tribute to Her Majesty. We do have some questions, but I'm going to use my prerogative and invite my colleague, Daniel Lipson, who has been researching some of the materials that you referred to, David, and ask Daniel to ask our first question. Then I promise I will refer to those in the chat. Daniel.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much, David, for this amazing talk full of very interesting stories. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just mention one. Have you come across any publications or pamphlets or anything regarding the Baal Shem of London in the 18th century, famous and infamous?
You could not have asked me a better question for me, because I actually have the original portrait of the Baal Shem of London, the one which is always done as the Baal Shem Tov, which is always claimed to be the founder of Hasidism, but is actually a portrait of the Baal Shem of London.
That was going to be my second question.
I've never seen anything really printed about him until, in terms of contemporary pamphlets. Most of it is sort of later. Herman Adler and so on wrote about him and various others. I think, I'm not entirely sure, I have to check. There's a book called, by Alexander, the same printer I'm speaking about, A Life of Benjamin Goldsmith. And Benjamin Goldsmith was a patron of Dr. Falk, the Baal Shem of London. So I'd have to look and see whether he mentions it there. He may do. You'll probably be aware, Daniel, that there's still people who make pilgrimages to the grave of the Baal Shem of London in Alderney Road Cemetery. So he still has a following somewhere.
I hope to do that next time I'm in London as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Daniel, was there anything else you wanted to ask, or shall I refer to some of those in the chat?
I think you can refer to the others, otherwise we'll be here all evening.
Because I'm hoping that you'll be able to ask some questions to David in person at some point. Yeah. I don't want to go into sort of lots of details here, but we've had a request of somebody who wants to share an anecdote with you, David, about the late Rabbi Sachs and his book Controversy. I don't know if we've got time to listen to I think it was Joshua Fogel, to listen to the anecdote here, but we will find a way of putting you in touch. Maybe, Joshua, you can send us your email address and then we can pass that on to Professor Latchman. And then we've had a couple of questions here from Sandy. Are there books, and Sandy, could you be a bit more specific? Are there books about this time in Jewish history available as a recent and available published book in the UK?
Well, Karen, if I may, I can plug my books now. So I have, I did, as you kindly mentioned, produce a book for the 150th anniversary of the United Synagogue last year, which has got 150 orders of service from my collection on coronations and other events, with various other material, again, from my collection. Probably more relevant is the book that you also mentioned that hopefully will come out in a few months, called 10 Chief Rabbis, where I go from Aaron Hart to Rabbi Lord Sachs. And I have done a blog on the Times of Israel site, which is so far sort of making its way through various Chief Rabbis. So the early Chief Rabbis are dealt with. I think there's about 4 or 5 blogs up now on the Times of Israel site, if the person would like to look at those.
So that was a very timely question. And then you've been asking about publishers who publish UK Jewish history for children. And Sandy, I actually am in touch with the publisher. I don't know if I'm able to sort of advertise it here, but maybe David, you can, if there's any British publishers who you know of that you do publish Jewish history for children, or UK Jewish history.
I mean, it's a shame because there was Mrs. Bethsian Abrahams, who was a wonderful woman who I only met when she was extremely elderly, produced, I think, in the 60s, a sort of child's history of the Jews in England. It would be very good for somebody to redo that, update it, and produce it again. I'm not aware of anything that's been done very recently, but I may not know. So there may be others listening to the call who know more about it.
You've just reminded me that my grandfather gave me a book on Jews in the UK many years ago, so I will look that one up.
I do have to tell you a very interesting anecdote, which was that years and years ago I was put on the council of the Jewish Historical Society. Perhaps people on the call are members of it or of the Israeli branch. And one of the meetings I said, they were asking how could they get more young members. And so I said, if everybody on the committee actually started to talk to anybody who turned up at the meetings, instead of all talking to each other, then it would be very, very helpful. And Mrs. Abrams, who was then probably in her 90s, came up to me and she said, I said the same to the president in 1928, she said, and they took no notice then, and they'll take no notice now. And so it proved.
Oh, very reminiscent. Anthony Latchman, I don't know if there's a family connection.
A relative.
Well, without the T, but Anthony Latchman has asked, what happened to Rabbi Jacobs?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very good question. Many people on the call will know. And I should say ours was originally Latchman without a T, so perhaps we are related. Louis Jacobs founded this Masorti movement. They had the New London Synagogue. They now also have the New North London Synagogue with Rabbi Wittenberg, and it is a Masorti movement in the UK. Whether and he was its spiritual leader until his death a few years ago. Whether Rabbi Jacobs really wanted to found such a movement, I think is open to question. But he did have a religious movement. I see him actually as a tragic figure, as somebody who was effectively incredibly honest and said what he believed to his own discredit, his own loss. And there's a wonderful, terrible line in his autobiography where he speaks about his Cheder teacher and says that his Cheder teacher who inspired him to become a rabbi, he said, now he would be ashamed of me. And I think that's really a real tragedy. So I see Louis Jacobs as an extraordinary tragedy driven by intellectual honesty, in fact, even though I don't agree with his views.
That's very poignant. We're having some wonderful compliments here about spanning 3 centuries, and there's somebody who's written as an Anglo-Jew exiled in Spain. He found this very interesting and full of nostalgia. There's a comment here from Wendy. The Masorti in the UK and in some communities in Israel is far nearer modern Orthodox communities than Reform. And in Israel, they're lumped together, but this is incorrect. Do you want to say anything about some of the sort of approaches to? I think I would
agree with that. Yeah. I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think certainly, people I know who go to the New North London, they have 2 or 3 different services. Probably the most orthodox of them is almost indistinguishable from the United Synagogue. There are some where men and women sit separately or sit together or whatever. I suspect, given the pluralism we're seeing in the United Synagogue, given the greater role of women, there is going to be a bit of a blending. And it's very interesting, of course, as I think I said, that English Reform, the West London Synagogue, was never proper German or American Reform. Liberal Judaism, much more akin to German or American Reform. English Reform was sort of driven by the desire for a bit more decorum, wanting to have shuls which were more to the west of the city, where you were not allowed actually to open a synagogue if the city, for example, in a branch synagogue of the Great Synagogue, which eventually became Great Portland Street, it was announced every Shabbat from the pulpit, this is not an independent synagogue. It is a branch of the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place. So there was a desire not to allow these sort of separate communities. And so part of Reform was actually a desire for separate communities. So I saw, Karen, a comment from my old friend and best man, Jonathan Topper, who was obviously on the call, but I didn't, because I was talking, I didn't see what he said. So If you
Right.
proceed.
Lovely. Well, Rabbi Jacobs is coming up again. Nancy Kaplan has said perhaps people here would be interested, and there's a website maintained about Rabbi Jacobs, louisjacobs.org. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
Yes,
David.
indeed.
Right.
Yes, indeed. There's also been a biography called Reason to Believe, which has been published very recently. And earlier, Rabbi Jacobs wrote his autobiography called Making Inquiries. So that's all part of it.
Well, Jonathan Tropper is asking, do you think that Rabbi Jacobs' theology was fundamentally different to Rabbi Sax's?
Oh dear, dear. I'm not answering that question. That's a real minefield. I think all I will say is it would have been very interesting to have had Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Jacobs in a debate together, discussing their various theologies. I think what I would say is Rabbi Jacobs came out with things in terms of biblical criticism, which I don't think Rabbi Sachs would have said publicly. I don't know what he thought in private, but I think it is interesting, and I think somebody else commented on it, the Rabbi Sachs's book where he writes about the importance or the value of all religions had to be, of course, redone after a lot of orthodox criticism, and that was perhaps a shame, whatever. Very interesting, the comment that's just been made, Karen, about Rabbi Petrkowski, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, because of course, saying he was a hero to Rabbi Jacobs, of course, Petrkowski wrote the definitive book on David Nieto and on his theology and all the stuff that I talked about relations with Spinoza and Shabtai Tzvi and so on, which I think is a fascinating topic.
There's somebody, Noreen, can I ask you to retype your message, because you asked me about that.
I can speak it if you like. I always wondered what the difference was between federation and united. Was there some sort of breakaway, or what was the reason behind it? I've lived in Israel for 50 years, but when I lived in Gantz Hill, there was the United Synagogue and there was the federation.
Yes.
Why were these two separate? I mean, they were both orthodox.
Yes, an excellent question. I mean, basically, and I could have dealt with that if I'd had more time. It relates to the fact that when the immigrants came over, they did not want to daven in these large cathedral synagogues that the United Synagogue had, the Great Central and so on. And so Samuel Montague, who was Lord Swathling, who was, Anglo-Jewish cousinhood, but more religious, founded the Federation of Synagogues in order to bring together all the small chevras that were being started. So people would start, whoever came from a particular town, they would start a small shul and whatever. They were very sort of, what shall we say, insanitary and sort of dangerous and fire hazards and so on. So he tried to bring them all together. One could argue that that was a wonderful philanthropic act. One could also argue that it was creating a power base, that the Rothschilds ran the United Synagogue. He saw himself as Lord Swathling as equivalent to the Rothschilds, and so he founded this sort of federation thing. I think one has to remember that the establishment of Anglo-Jewry was really, really worried about all these immigrants. What they were doing. Were they doing stille chuppahs, where they were doing marriages without sanction by the local authorities? Were they doing a get without a civil divorce and so on? So effectively, the federation was a way of sort of controlling that, but having a separate power base. Today, it's an interesting struggle, which, even though you've been in Israel, still goes on here, where the federation is sort of effectively now trying to take the left wing of the Union of Orthodox and bring it into the federation by moving a bit more to the right. So it is trying to position itself as a bit to the right of the United Synagogue at the moment. But it was essentially a social phenomenon rather than a religious phenomenon.
There's a comment or a question, I suppose, from Anita, that there's very little written about Sandys Row Synagogue. The chief rabbi of the time refused to come to its opening. I'm curious to hear, because I've actually visited there and it was a fascinating experience.
It's very interesting that there were this small group of sort of independent synagogues like Sandys Row, which were sort of orthodox, generally followed the line of the chief rabbi, but weren't part of the United Synagogue in any way. And Sandys Row was like that. And to give you another example, the Western Synagogue, which eventually merged with Marble Arch, was for 200 years an independent synagogue, they refused to read the Cherem against the West London Synagogue. So the Cherem against the West London Synagogue that I read to you was read from the pulpit of the great synagogue, from the central and so on, was not read from the Western Synagogue, even though it was nominally, well, as it was orthodox, because they didn't have to do what the Chief Rabbi said. I don't know that much about Sandys Row, but Sandys Row is in a very similar thing, and obviously the Chief Rabbi would have liked to bring it under his authority, but didn't.
Fine, thank you. I'm going to ask you something which is not related to what you've presented, but what everybody can see behind you. And I think this should be a nice way of finishing off, unless there's somebody who's going to quickly sneak in another question. But it's from Jonathan Cohen, and I hope this is not too relevant. Definitely not. I'm curious about the many Ridgeway Seder plates in your showcase. Are there so many variants? Were they in English production? And do you know anything about their famous mistranslation of chazeret as salt water?
Interesting, I didn't know that. The last point I certainly don't know, and I shall run after this talk is over to look at the plates to see. The plates themselves are actually very interesting. So if I can tilt a little bit. So the top row, if you can see, are the standard commercial plates. So there were two types. There was a matzah plate and a Seder plate on which you have all the different things. And they were issued in blue, red, and black. And they are pretty common. All the ones below are various combinations of colors. So they're like a blue one with a pink border or whatever. Those are all much less common. I've been collecting them for a long time. And they essentially are samples that the firm used when they fired the kiln. So when you fire the kiln, apparently, people on the call may know more about pottery than I do, you have to fire it up and you have to do test plates. And so they did these test plates in various colors, basically for their own entertainment. And they were never produced commercially, so they're much rarer. They are all English. There are French ones. All the ones that I have are all English because I'm very strict with myself. Don't buy non-UK things. There are French ones, and I can throw out all those on the call. If any of you know of a green one, or green and yellow, which is English, please tell me, because I once saw one in a shop in Jerusalem and I didn't buy it, and I think it was English. For years and years, I've got very excited when I've seen in auctions green ones, and they're always French, to the extent that a particular Hasidic auction house had one, and it said Tepper Seder Plate London, green, and I showed you a green picture. And I sent an email saying, may I see the other side? Because on the other side, it says whether it's England or France. And the guy said to me, this is most certainly English. And then he sent a picture and it said Tepper Paris. So if anybody knows of an English one, which is green, then please let me know. And I won't say you can name your own price, but I certainly would be interested in adding it to my display.
Right, well, that's a challenge here, and this recording will be going out to many. So we will definitely hope somebody can keep a lookout for that. It definitely makes me think that we need to have another session with you, maybe coming up to Pesach, where you could maybe talk more about those plates. It's been really fascinating and very nostalgic for me personally to listen to your talk. And of course, we're very much looking forward to hosting you in Jerusalem soon in person. And I'm sure the colleagues that are on this call will be wanting to carry on some of those discussions. So really many thanks, David, and many thanks to our audience. I especially want to say a big thank you and appreciation to those of you who have joined us throughout this series, because I have been noticing some returning names, which is a great validation of what we've tried to do. We do hope to resume some of these talks later in the year because they have proved so popular, and we hope to be focusing on some other communities in the UK. And of course, we'll send out details of those in good time. Meanwhile, you're all invited to join us again next Sunday for our event, Jewish Wisdom for a Secular World, featuring Professor David Weitzner in conversation with DJ Schneeweiss. Anyway, many thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks again so much to David for a fascinating tour of your collections and the history of Anglo-Jewry. And we look forward to seeing you again. I think some more people are adding their thanks and comments here. But really, thank you all for your compliments and positive messages. And good evening from Jerusalem.
Thank you.